example, as we can see here, so someone brought this up early and I'm glad they did. Homeostasis is bringing about changes in opposite directions, okay? So if we raise body temperature, the change is going to be to decrease it and vice versa. And that's what helps to maintain certain internal environments, or what we call dynamic constancy. So dynamic constancy is not that we keep something stable or the same, but that we always strive to keep it the same. So there's not some sort of mechanism that keeps body temperature at 37. It's not very rigid or very fixed, but rather it's just detecting if body temperature has increased or dropped and then making the relative changes to get it back to where it needs to be. Okay, that's a very small concept, or very kind of small part of the definition to understand, is that we don't try to keep any of these variables fixed or rigid or force them to stay the same, but we just detect if they're changing and then bring about the corrective mechanisms as a response. All right, and then lastly here on this slide, we have some of the other examples. We mentioned this earlier. We've got blood glucose levels, we've got blood pH, we talked about body temperature, we talked about blood pressure, blood sugar, and so on. Okay. And then positive feedback, I kind of touched on this earlier. This is an end process that helps to perpetuate or augment a certain process. This action is going in the opposite of a negative feedback, and it's going to amplify the said change. There are very few and rare examples in the body of positive feedback. It is not as common a mechanism as negative feedback is, because it's actually going to take us further away from our set point. But there are certain times, certain examples in our physiology where that is actually a desirable or a desired result. So an example is going to be a blood vessel that's damaged. We'll talk about this when we look at blood clotting in a few units down. But this is a process that helps to begin forming a clot if we have an injury to a vessel. So let's say you cut yourself, a small paper cut, it starts to bleed. The mechanism that helps to correct that bleeding and helps to form a clot initially is one of positive feedback, but that eventually ends in a negative feedback cycle. So positive feedback is the process of bringing more clotting factors to the site in order to help to lay down that initial clot. And then when we have secured a clot, or what we call a plug, to help stop the bleeding, then that cycle ends in a negative feedback. So positive feedback are not indefinite. They last for a short period of time, and then they ultimately end in a negative feedback event. Okay. Another example that we'll talk about in the reproductive unit is the strength of uterine contraction. So during childbirth, we need to potentiate or augment the strength of uterine contractions. And so there's an initial period during labor where there's a positive feedback cycle that stimulates more hormones to create stronger contractions. Stronger contractions release more hormones that create even stronger contractions. And that's what we mean by this positive feedback event that is for a specific purpose, for a specific time, and then after labor, that will end with a negative feedback to close that cycle. Okay, so I'll point out some of these positive feedback examples as we encounter them in other units. But I want to point out here that it's not a part of homeostasis because it's not the opposite mechanism or the opposite direction of change. It's actually taking us away from our set point, whereas negative feedback is bringing us back to our set point. And so I really want to point that difference out here. Okay, so here's a little schematic of one of the positive feedback examples. So the pituitary gland, which is one of our master hormone glands, master endocrine glands in the brain, secretes LH, or luteinizing hormone. That hormone stimulates our ovaries to secrete estrogen. Estrogen is actually going to go back to the pituitary gland and potentiate more luteinizing hormone secretion. And this is what actually brings about a very specific event in the menstrual cycle, which is what we call the LH surge. So during the middle of the menstrual cycle, there's a period where we need luteinizing hormone to be at a very high level. And so we elicit this positive feedback cycle so that estrogen begets more LH, LH creates more estrogen, and this happens over and over until we get luteinizing hormone at a very peak, and then that ends in a negative feedback. So for very short periods of time, in very specific rare examples in the body, do we see positive feedback happening. Okay. Any questions on positive feedback? So that's an area that students typically have a little bit of a hard time differentiating from negative feedback or kind of understanding how they differ. So I'll kind of pause here to see if there are any questions. And then we will wrap up. Okay. So the last thing we want to touch on here is what we call intrinsic and extrinsic regulation. So this is the process of regulation that happens within the effector organs that we spoke about. Some of the examples were the glands, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, such as the heart. And this is how we regulate these variables. So we can have two forms of regulation. We have intrinsic regulation. This is where the cells of a specific organ sense a change and respond to that change right away. So it's going to happen at a local level. It's not going to involve the brain. It's not going to involve the integrating centers. It's going to be a change that is detected within the heart, as an example. And then the cells of the heart will do something different to correct that change or send signals to their neighboring cells to respond accordingly. So it's happening locally, and hence we use the term intrinsic regulation. That can be compared to extrinsic regulation. This is where the brain gets involved. This is where signals are sent to the medulla or the brainstem. And then this is where other endocrine organs, as well as the nervous system, are involved. And so this is a more widespread response than we see with the local response of intrinsic regulation. Okay, these are concepts or forms of regulation that we're going to talk about in almost every unit that we'll encounter in the brain, in the nervous system, in the heart, in the lungs. There are two main ways that a system can regulate itself. It can do so within itself, where the cells make the change that's needed, or it can do so more broadly by involving neurons, involving the brain, involving those integrating centers and those input and output signals.